Okay, hey, thank you everyone for coming, and as I was saying, please feel free to come up and sit at the table. We're a very inclusive and friendly group here. It's great to see you all. I know it's a very busy time of semester, so it's wonderful to see such a healthy group gathered here. For those of you I haven't met before, my name is Jacinta O'Hagan, and I'm the Director of the Graduate Centre in Governance and International Affairs. And this is what we call one of our Flashpoint series. Flashpoint, you have to go like that, Flashpoint. And the Flashpoint series are short conversations about topical issues. What we do is we get a panel of experts together to talk about a hot issue that's happening in politics today. Each of them will speak for about 7 minutes each, which should allow us then plenty of time for comments and discussions and conversation between them. So first up, let me introduce a panel just in order in which they're sitting here. To my left, we've got Paul Lucas, and Paul is known to many of you. Paul's an adjunct fellow in the School of Political Science and International Studies. From 1996 to 2012, he was member for Lytton in the Queensland State Parliament, and he held several ministerial and cabinet positions. And I suppose most important of those was that he was Deputy Premier from 2007 to 2011, and then Attorney General for Queensland from 2011 to 2012. And he's a very active and keen student of politics, domestic and international politics. So I'm very pleased to have Paul as part of the panel. Next to Paul is Frank Moles, and Frank is a senior lecturer here in the School of Political Science and International Studies. His research
Not quite lecturer.
Oh, well. His research interests include governance, public policy, political psychology, and he's particularly interested in the politics of leadership and psychology of leadership, of voter attitudes, and looking at this in particular attitude formation within the European Union. And his research has been published in a number of international journals, and most recently he's published a path-breaking book with Yolanda Yetten, The Wealth Paradox, Economic Prosperity and the Hardening of Attitudes, and that's published by Cambridge University Press in 2017, and he's going to be speaking to that today. And then on my far left we've got Duncan McDonald, who is a senior lecturer in the Griffith Business School at Griffith University, and it's a pleasure to be able to invite one of our colleagues from across the river, as we say, to speak with us today. So he was previously a Marie Curie Fellow and then a John Monnet Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, and he's also held appointments in the University of Turin and the University of Lausanne. Now his interest and what he's writing very actively on is on political parties, populism and Euroscepticism, and he's got an ARC Discovery grant at the moment looking at radical right populist parties in Europe. And he's published a number of books, Populists in Power and Saving the People, How Populists Have Hijacked Religion, which are incredibly relevant to what we're doing today. So what is it we're talking about today? And just thinking about today's Flashpoint, I went back to a very interesting book by Mark Mazower published in 1998 called Dark Continent. Mazower is an international historian and particularly focuses on the politics of Europe and also of international organisations. And to quote him, he's looking at the politics between the First and Second World War. We should certainly not assume that democracy's victory in the Cold War proves its deep roots in Europe's soil. History tells us otherwise. Triumphant in 1918, it was virtually extinct 20 years on. So Mazower was writing in 1998, a period of time where our confidence in the New World Order in the wake of the Cold War was beginning to crack with conflicts in Bosnia, the former Soviet Union, Africa, the Middle East. But what was interesting about that is a number of those challenges were challenges to some extent from without what we would have thought the liberal democratic, liberal international order. What we're looking at the moment is some really interesting movements that seem to be challenging that order from within, or seem to be challenging liberal politics from within. So the rise of populist parties, the rise of extremism, different forms of political extremism. But are they really challenging democracy, or are they a new expression of democracy, a different expression of democracy? So what we're going to talk about today with our experts is what's happening, populism and extremism, why is it happening, and what are its implications. And with that, I will turn over to Duncan first up. He's got a few slides that he's going to talk to. Duncan, please
All right.
take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Jacinta, and thanks to all of you for giving up your lunchtime and coming along today. You probably won't recognise all the people in the photo here. I imagine you'll recognise the lady in the middle, Marine Le Pen. The other two are Heinz-Christian Strache, who's the leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, and Matteo Salvini, who's the leader of the Northern League in Italy. The choice of photo isn't entirely casual. I didn't just go to Google Images and say right-wing populist leaders and pick out the first one that came with a thumbs up. I chose it actually because they exemplify the main points that I want to make here today, which are that these are parties that are not episodic. They're parties which can survive leadership change, bad single election results. The parties which have ownership over key issues in Europe, like immigration, like Euroscepticism. They're parties which have strong organisations. And this is exemplified in these three. All these three have recently, in the last decade at least, succeeded charismatic founder leaders of their respective parties. Marine Le Pen obviously succeeded her father. Matteo Salvini succeeded Umberto Bossi in the Northern League, who created that party and was seen very much as one and the same with the party. You couldn't really imagine the party without the leader. Heinz-Christian Strache took over the Austrian Freedom Party when it was in the doldrums after a terrible experience in government. His vote was going through the floor, and it had lost its charismatic leader, Jörg Haider. So these three leaders and parties, as I say, they show that what we thought about these parties about 10, 15 years ago has proved to be untrue. We thought that these parties were essentially, well, like the parties of this woman here. We thought that right-wing populist parties were like One Nation in Australia. They were parties that would burn brightly under a charismatic leader who could campaign very effectively and rouse people to vote for them maybe in one or two elections. But then, because they lacked organisation, because they lacked the skills to run a party long term, they would inevitably crash and burn, and that's indeed what happened, as we know, of One Nation Australia. It's not what has happened with parties like these in Europe. The European experience is very different. It goes against what all the theory about populism was telling us at the time. According to the theory on populism, as I said, parties should have been like One Nation. They weren't. It was different. Not only that, the second point I want to get across to you today is that in addition to not simply being flash parties that eventually implode, these are also parties which, going against what we thought in the theoretical literature on populism about 15, 20 years ago, they're parties that can govern. They're parties that are increasingly accepted as government partners by mainstream parties, mainly the centre-right, but also we're starting to see in Europe of the centre-left in places like Denmark and Austria. And they're parties that when they get into government, especially the second time round or the third time round, can achieve key policy victories without falling apart, without losing their core support, who might be upset about compromises and so on. No, they're parties that can actually go. And these are two very important points. They're parties that are essentially here to stay. They're parties that may well get into power, and they may well do well when they get into power. These all go against the received wisdom on populism that we have from a lot of the historical literature. Okay? As an example, I just picked one because of the time limits. If any of you have ever studied populism, you'll have come across Paul Taggart. Paul wrote in 15 years ago, Paul said, and this is very much typical of the literature there, he said populist politicians emerge and grow quickly and gain attention but find it difficult to sustain that momentum, therefore it will usually fade fast. Precisely, the Hansen model would have confirmed theories like that. Everything we've seen since then would suggest things go in a different direction. If you look, I've just put a list of the parties that have, right-wing populist parties that have emerged in Europe over the last 40 years, going right back to the French Front National, which incredibly is even older than I am. All these parties have been able to gain traction, to set up strong organizations, to survive electoral setbacks, to get over their founder leaders retiring. We have this idea that charisma is very hard to pass on. We would have said a lot of these parties had charismatic founder leaders, and yet they're still there. Not only are they still there, they're doing better than ever. You look at the front, there's been a lot of ridiculous talk in the media recently about peak populism after Marine Le Pen's result. Well, Marine Le Pen's result was disappointing primarily for the media, just as Geert Wilders' result was disappointing. according to media expectations. Just as Pauline Hanson's result in Western Australia was disappointing according to media expectations. If you'd gone to any of those parties a few years ago and said, this is what you're going to do in that election a couple of years' time, it would have bitten your hand. Okay? There are parties that are resilient, in part because of organisation, also because they have unique ideological offers on their key issues. The parties that are certainly not episodic. Okay? But then in the theoretical literature on populism, going back over the last few decades, they said, okay, well, even if these parties may well be here to stay, don't get too worried, because once they get into government, they'll implode. The populist party won't be able to survive the pressure of being in government and maybe having to compromise with coalition partners and not follow through on its outlandish promises. And the quote I put up here from Yves Meny and Yves Sorel, in one of the landmark books on populism in 2002, Democracies and Populist Challenge, I think it was called, they said very clearly, populist parties are by nature neither durable nor sustainable parties of government. They'll either be integrated into the mainstream, disappear, or remain in opposition. That view was very much confirmed by the first case of right-wing populists really coming into government and staying for any length of time, which happened in 2000 in Austria. And Austria is often taken, even today, as being a key example of why populists in government won't necessarily do very well, because what happened in Austria, most of you are far too young to remember, but what happened in Austria was that the Austrian Freedom Party, right-wing populist party, was invited into coalition government, and the other 14, as it was at the time, European Union member states imposed sanctions on Austria, said, no, you can't do that. I thought, well, that'll teach them. That didn't. This is the amount of right-wing populist parties we've had in power since then. Okay, so we've seen from Austria, which had the sanctions only lasted 9 months, at which point the EU realised that they were essentially useless. We've had right-wing populists in a whole series of EU member states and Switzerland and Norway, right from north to southern Europe. So this is clearly a growing phenomenon. There are parties that are increasingly being invited to share power with mainstream centre-right parties, and in the coming years we may well see even with centre-left parties. But okay, you say that doesn't actually disprove the theory. The theory said that if they get into power, they'll fail. Well, not necessarily. Daniele Albertazzi and I did a book in 2015, Populism and Power, in which we looked very closely at the experience of the Italians and the Swiss, not in their first time in power. In the first time in power for a party, they will always face certain difficulties. But we looked at second and third times in power. We found they achieved some of their key policy goals in immigration, Euroscepticism, law and order, these kind of things. They don't necessarily lose votes. They don't necessarily lose support amongst their mid-ranking representatives, grassroots, and so on. Okay? They don't moderate their tones either. This is a poster from the Northern League's time in office showing we stopped the invasion of a load of African migrants coming across. This is the Swiss People's Party. I've spoken to actually the people in Zurich who designed this poster. They claim it's entirely coincidental that there's 3 white sheep kicking a black sheep off the Swiss flag. I have my doubts. But this was done while the Swiss People's Party held the Justice Ministry. I don't see a moderation of language going on or message. Okay? So, to conclude, as I think I've stressed, these are parties that are increasingly fixed points of their party systems. They're increasingly successful parties of government. So I suppose the question that I wanted to put out to you here today to also think about is we're facing now the question, how should mainstream parties treat right-wing populists? And this is a question that's relevant also in Australia, because we've seen over the course of a year, for example, Malcolm Turnbull a year ago said Pauline Hanson had no place in Parliament, and then his party was doing election deals with them in Western Australia. So obviously the ground's moving here too on this. Should they embrace or ostracise them? And also, how should right-wing populist parties treat mainstream ones? I think One Nation now realise that they might actually get burnt if they go into more deals with the Liberal Party. That's going to be an issue in Queensland here. And what we see is we see a whole range there from Sweden and France, where there's what we call a cordon sanitaire, and there's no cooperation. The mainstream parties say no, even if it costs us going into government, we're not doing business with you. In Denmark and Netherlands, they go for the halfway house and taking parliamentary support in exchange for policy concessions. And then a place like Austria and Norway, they go the full hog, and right-wing populists have seats in cabinet and so on. These are issues that, as I say, are not just relevant for Western Europe. I think they're becoming increasingly relevant for Australia. Whether or not One Nation implodes, and I believe they will, I think there'll be more parties of this ilk in this country, and these will be issues we'll have to deal with. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Thank you.
Do you want to do questions?
No,
Leave them
we
for
just.
last?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Just maybe here. Right.
Probably. Is it this button here to go forward?
Yep.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I realise that I've got too many slides, so I have to probably skip a few to make things manageable within the time available. I think what my research has in common, or our research, I want to emphasise that this is research that I've done collaboratively with people in the School of Psychology, particularly Yolanda Yetten, but also others. I think we're both a bit of contrarians here, that we kind of like to challenge the conventional wisdom view of what we tend to think, what we think we know about populist parties. And our research does the exact same thing. What got us interested in, or when did we start thinking about there's something here that's to be explained, conventional wisdom thinking isn't necessarily correct, is an example from the Netherlands, which caught our attention. In 2002, we see that Pim Fortuyn does extremely well in the elections. He gets assassinated just before the election, which is a different story, but he was the first populist leader in the Netherlands that we saw coming up, who made an argument that the Netherlands was rotten to the core. He published a short booklet, 120 pages if I remember correctly, in which he says the country is in tatters, it's on the brink, it's 5 to 12, the typical populist kind of rhetoric. That's coming out in May 2002. The same month, May 2002, The Economist runs a feature article praising the Dutch economy by saying, well, what have these Dutch governments been doing? Because the economy is a bit lukewarm, but the Netherlands is a thriving economy. So you can see that there is a kind of paradox here with the talk around decline, drama, things are not going well, and the economists telling everyone what's happening. These Dutch have done a really great job. At the same time, Wim Kok, the then Prime Minister, is traveling to Westminster and Washington to explain the Polder model, the third way politics model. Here is a paradox. But of course, what we now should remember is that which narrative of the two won. If we go by the election results, it's the 17% of LPF, the party of Pim Fortuyn, which he secured, that tells you something about how he got traction over the popular sentiment. So that made us think a bit more cautiously about the assumptions that we see in talk about populism. And there's, of course, two very pervasive assumptions that you'll ask anyone in the street and they'll say, of course, isn't that self-evident? One is that crises, economic crises, provide fertile soil for populist parties. Right? That's what we know, we think. The logic is crises increase hardship, deprivation, frustration, aggression, lashing out, and so forth. There's a very good body of theory that can explain that. Realistic conflict over scarce resources, the pool of resources gets slimmer, conflict gets intense. The second assumption is about who votes for populist parties. And of course, there too, it is about working class grievances, working class deprivation. We call that sometimes relative deprivation. So we were interested in the when and who assumption that we see everywhere, even today. When we started looking at some evidence, and it was quite amateurish perhaps initially, we thought, well, let's take a few countries and see longitudinally when these parties that Duncan has been talking about, when they actually scored their biggest victories. The narrative we would currently hold is that the global financial crisis has created some kind of fertile ground for the sprouting of populist parties. However, if we get into our helicopters and we see what actually happened, we see a different picture. Sweden may seem to be fitting the standard narrative because we see that post the global financial crisis, we see that the Sweden Democrats get their first seat in parliament ever. So that would seem to confirm the stereotype. But we found many other countries, and I'll go through them really quickly, where we see much more, and this fits really nicely with what Duncan has been saying, that these parties have been a lot more established and done well, regardless of things like the economy. The grey area, I should have explained that earlier, is GDP per capita growth. And the dotted line here is unemployment figures, which would seem fairly obvious indicators of economic boom or bust. So I'll go through these very quickly, but among our sample group of countries that we looked at more affluent countries, countries with pretty good economies, including, of course, Switzerland, right, which is the envy. If Australia is the envy of the world in economic terms, of course, Switzerland would trump that even. So our end conclusion from looking at all these countries was that there is really no simple correlation between economic crisis and populist voting. That was the one assumption that we could quite easily dismantle as a bit of a myth. In fact, we also found tremendous successes in times of economic prosperity. It goes the other way, if anything. Of course, then the question comes up, well, maybe it's immigration flows. It's when there's a sudden refugee crisis, and of course that can't be discarded. But even when you look at it from that, we went through the same exercise, and there's no direct simple causation there, or correlation, I should say, between waves of immigration historically and when these parties do well. So that was an assumption we felt quite confident about, that doesn't hold up. And of course, we're not the first ones to note these things. Ignazi actually cited in Wilson and Hainsworth in 2012, he notes already that populist parties were thriving before the global financial crisis. So we're not the first ones to actually be a bit puzzled here. But we started collecting more and more data and information about what is really going on, in particular around these elections. We found, for example, Ipsos research showing that the Dutch BBB voters in the Netherlands in 2010 earned more than average, not less than average. We now saw, and this is more recent, the Brexit and Trump exit polls, people have analyzed these by now, and we have some references to work by them, showing exactly that the stereotypical view of the working class man disaffected in cities in decline is not really reflected in the data necessarily. In fact, it's often more the middle class vote. Here too we see, especially the Trump voter earning more than average, not less than average. This is Rothwell, Diego, and Rosell, which fitted perfectly with what we have been finding elsewhere. Of course, when I presented this work, everyone goes, well, hang on, Frank. How about Hitler, the Nazi regime? Wasn't it off the Great Depression that we saw the NSDAP do well? So we looked at electoral studies papers that we came across that looked at NSDAP voting in Weimar Germany. And guess what? We found a really interesting pattern. That the Ruhrgebiet, the labor heartland of Germany, where the biggest industrial areas, state labor. They never went to, stereotyping a little bit, they did not turn to the NSDAP. Where was the NSDAP support? Greatest it was in the really terribly regions in decline near the Czech border, and in the more affluent Protestant northern rural areas of Germany. So there's an interesting pattern, and I'll come back to that in a moment. More striking research into the city of Braunschweig, where you see levels of NSDAP support ranging from 61 to 65% in the 7 most wealthy precincts of the city of Braunschweig. Right? So we came up with these nuggets of gold we found when we started looking. So to summarize a little bit, Assumption 1, we think, is really not borne out by the evidence. Assumption 2, the who is actually voting for populist parties is not necessarily incorrect, the working class, working man idea, but it's, we think, incomplete. It's not just the losers of globalization in Rust Belt states, we think. What we found, if anything, also through experimental research, which we stumbled across, is an interesting bimodal V-curve pattern. What is that? This has been accounted in research into prejudice by sociologists, social psychologists, and even political scientists, who actually were interested in prejudice and actually made people to feel either quite poor or middle class or wealthy. And what you see is that in these experimental situations, the greatest prejudice and xenophobia, anti-support for immigration messages comes from the bottom and the top, but not from the middle. Hence it's called the V-curve pattern. So there's some really interesting stuff. We actually replicated that ourselves here on campus with an experiment. When you see this, you can see the world slightly differently. The referendum that Duncan just referred to, when this happened, we thought, well, there are how many cantons? I can't remember the exact number, 34 cantons in Switzerland. If we get the data on how they are doing economically, we should be able to predict stronger support for immigration, the curbing of immigration in the poorer cantons, not so much in the average canton, and a bump again in the top cantons. And below and behold, what we found is that V-curve pattern came out when the results came out. Okay, I'll wrap up. The research that we did is, I could talk for hours, as you can probably tell. The Wealth Paradox was the book, is actually the work where we collected all the data, we presented our theories about it. What we are calling for is attention for 2 things, particularly that who is voting for populist parties. it's relative deprivation, but also relative gratification. Right? So if you think of the bimodal support of populist parties, it becomes easy to explain some of the things we've seen. Think of the Trump election that no one saw coming. That may well have been because people only focused on relative deprivation, the working class man in Pennsylvania, and not the more wealthy voters in Florida, for example. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So Paul.
Thanks very much, Cindy. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I can sit here a bit easier, be at everyone else's level. But look, there is nothing new in the world in reaction to immigration or minority groups. Jews, Chinese, when we see Chinese pogroms regularly in places like Indonesia, and we hope not, but perhaps potentially in the future again. The perennial Catholics and Protestant fights, depending on what majority country you're in, and the manifestation of that. I think perhaps what we've found in the human condition is that when faced with a domestic issue of whatever nature, the best way to deal with that has politically often been to find a distraction to keep people otherwise occupied and off the performance of governments in the actual sense. Having said that, you can't just make an issue politically out of nothing. There's got to be an underlying fear set or a concern. And I'm very interested, not the fact that hearing me talk's pretty boring, but hearing Duncan and Frank I found really compelling in terms of those gross measures. And I think that it's really interesting when one actually says, well, what's happened in Australia? We actually have done economically extremely well. But if you actually have a look at some of the debate, and the Australian had an article from John Black about 2 months ago where he talked about Townsville saying over a 10-year period of the current period of time, they've lost 24,000 people in employment in Townsville. And those people, when they would have been in employment, would have been people with a reasonable degree of wealth, not entry-level employment positions and the like. So I wonder whether in Australia, up until fairly recently, or indeed in the world, there's been a relative peace in terms of tolerance, and we're about to go back to, or we've come back into the more long-term norm of find someone else who you think's lower down the hierarchy to kick to make you feel better. And we have a history of that, of course, in Australia, White Australia policies, and indeed in the Second World War, when we dramatically increased migration into the country. There's some wonderful footage of Cornwall being at the wharves to welcome migrants, and what they did, even though the vast majority of migrants were from war-torn Mediterranean and Eastern Europe, welcoming the Baltic people on the boat because they all looked very blonde and very much like what Australians thought they looked like, because no one wanted to scare people when they had a look at the newsreels sitting in the movie cinema. So I don't think there's anything new about that. Once upon a time, I think people accepted in politics that there were haves and have-nots, and the haves were these sort of haves who were far, far greater, wealthier than we could ever aspire to be, and sort of the world accepted them in being in the castle on the hill, so to speak. But the modern world that we have now have haves and have-nots who are far different. The dual professionally educated, people on government incomes, for example, 2 doctors in a family who are on big money compared to perhaps what a working class sole or dual income family might be on. The haves aren't as have as they once would have been 100 years ago with servants running around, but proportionally there is a massively greater number of them in society. So people come across them far more often. They go to their kids' sporting events and see a whole line of BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes and Lexuses there, where once upon a time, they just simply wouldn't have seen that and wonder about that themselves. So what do? They attach to populist political parties in many instances. And I think populist political parties, notwithstanding we're not a religious country, and I'll mention that in a minute, are a bit like fundamentalist churches. And populist political leaders in Australia are a bit more like Elmer Gantry, totally flawed and do as I say, not as I do, but people go to them and go to the next one. So Hanson, we all support her. We're all out there giving how to votes for her. We want to run for her. She fails. Who's next? Katter. Who's next after him? Palmer. Who's next after him after he fails? Back to Hanson again. So it's like these people who go through this steady procession of fundamentalist churches to go to the next one that they can believe in before their hopes are dashed, but never once cease to say, isn't the problem me going to these fundamentalist churches in the first sense? As I said to you, that's really that's more a metaphor than I'm not talking about churches in themselves. And so Duncan mentioned the European experience in not being episodic, and obviously the evidence that he gives there is compelling, but the Australian experience certainly is. And I've seen no evidence in my experience that there's any likelihood that that's going to change. And one only needs to observe the behaviours of one nation at the current point in time. I was in Parliament, I was elected in 1996 and 98, the big spike came in with all those people who came in, and there would have been one or two of them who were competent. The rest of them were mad or bad or sad, as the old saying in politics goes, but totally unsuitable because they don't come through that traditional growth apprenticeship that mainstream political parties do. So what's the reaction to that? Dog whistling in other political parties that actually says things but doesn't really say it. And indeed, I'm surprised in Australia that, in fact, mainstream and the Conservatives in particular have been less reactionary than they otherwise could have been. And what they actually do is talk the rhetoric. But when you actually look at it, our migration intake is high and has always been high, and there's no real suggestion of winding it down. And our refugee intake is very, very high. And even Abbott increased the refugee intake, notwithstanding the rhetoric about boat people and the like. But they will talk the Howard talk of, we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come, which is absolutely centre casting out to say to people, you know, we don't like others who are different to us. So what's the remedy? The difference between Australia and I think there are two differences that we have, or three differences, sorry, that we have. One, 27% of Australians are born overseas. 27%. That's greater in proportion than any other OECD country. Massively greater than Britain. So we actually have a whole lot of people. And then when you take to how many have got a parent who's born overseas, you really get to higher levels of society. So I think that is one fundamental difference to us. Mind you, the new Hanson isn't anti-Asian anymore. You know, you don't hear the anti-Asian race rhetoric from Hanson anymore. It's anti-Muslim. You know, she's changed because if you want to actually divide people, you've got to pick off a small enough chunk for the slicer to be able to pick on. You pick on too many people, and you're picking on your support base. Secondly, Australia is not a religious country, so it is far harder to stir up religious fights. Religious fights only work in low grade political, behaviours in Australia when they're a proxy for race. And indeed, if you have a look at what went on in the earlier part of the 20th century, the stuff about Catholicism wasn't about Catholics; it was about Irish. Home rule is Rome rule and all that sort of stuff.
It was.
My mother used to say that they were anti-Catholic. You didn't buy Sanitarium because they had anti-Catholic leaflets inside their wheat bix, and that's why we wouldn't buy them. We only bought Vitabrits. So finally, I would say this. The other thing is that we don't have our voting system of compulsory preferential voting is quite different to other political systems. So mainstream political parties have far greater control over what happens with how their votes go, and in particularly in relation to surpluses in Senate voting elections. Mind you, Hanson's got enough to get people elected. So, and I think that you mentioned, or was it Frank, caught on sanitaire. I mean, it will be interesting to see in the future whether Australian mainstream political parties want to say, we're going to get rid of one nation by not preferencing so they don't get involved in lower house electorates. you'll never stop them from getting involved in the Senate, and whether they actually take that sort of action or whether they're prepared to say, okay, well, what we're going to end up in Australia now is Greens in inner city urban seats and One Nation in rural hinterland seats, and with all that comes as a result of that. Ironically, both political parties of all, if you wanted to demographically model, the most white political parties in their membership and support bases are One Nation and Greens, ironically. Where for the future? Will we see a situation where the way to attract more attention, we saw Qatar doing it recently, is like horror movies where you ramp up your anti-migrant rhetoric even more and more to try and attract, hey, look at me, come and vote for me. I don't know. There is a real risk. What I think mainstream political parties need to do is to actually start to talk about the benefits of migration to this country. No one seems to be out there enough saying, if you actually want to have an ageing population paid for in the future, you need to have people who in your workforce who can pay for it. The average migrant is younger and better educated than the rest of the population in Australia. There is an argument that this country needs migrants, and the more that we have, the better. And of course, we have the ability to choose who comes to our country in terms of migration policies, putting aside refugee policies, which is a different issue. And I think that we need to start to say that, and that migrants are your next door neighbours. They're not some small group who sits in some odd enclave. That's not how we have developed in this country. So there's some thoughts.
Thank you, Paul. I was going to invite questions, and first card off the rank is Shahara, please.
That was very interesting. So one question for Duncan, one for Frank. Duncan, you haven't really defined populism here, and I know that it's one of the kind of worst, one of the most widely debated issues. What is populism? But my understanding, populism is actually the lack of mediation that defines it. But the kind of processes that you're describing suggest that these parties are building a fairly solid party basis, which would suggest that they're not particularly populist in the way that it's traditionally understood. Maybe it's a kind of extreme right-wing party would be a better way to put it, but I don't know if you can call them populist anymore. But anyway, maybe you can talk to that. And Frank, I was wondering whether you would have gotten a different result if you looked at movements in inequality, like Gini coefficient or something like that, because it seems to me that a lot of the processes that we're talking about here are fairly slow burning. We're talking about 40 years of decline of the post-war compact, very slow movement. And I think as inequality rises, there's been a lot of big studies about this. People feel more insecure, especially people with some wealth. This is the old thing about, even Marx was, petty bourgeois, being pretty much the worst, the supporters of fascism, and so on. So I wonder if that would have explained, some of the paradox here. Thanks.
As you can see, I came prepared. Basically, there are a lot of definitions of populism out there, but there is thankfully now, apart from a few big name bandwagon jumpers in the last year who will remain nameless, and are from Harvard, there is a general consensus on what constitutes populism. It tends to be seen as the idea of a good people versus bad elites, and in the case of right-wing populism, you also have dangerous others. So it's this idea of the people are under siege from above by elites, be they political, cultural, financial, supranational, whatever, and from below by, it might be Muslims, it might be gay people, it might be people who are seen as welfare scroungers, Romani communities in Eastern Europe and so on. So the people, good, virtuous, genius, in reality all divisions are false creations by political parties. The people are under siege, and if we don't act now, everything's going to hit the fan, and the people are going to lose their sovereignty and so on. We might do it after. This is something else that came up, just on your comment about Australians, most Australians having an immigrant parent, or 27% of Australians being themselves born overseas. However, I think in a way you gave a counterpoint to that when you mentioned about how Hansen, of course, has swapped essentially one word in several decades, and that's Asians from Muslims. And can that
overcome
Yeah.
that very fact. Because I did a little survey with my students last year. I think my students are reasonably intelligent. They're lazy, but they're quite intelligent. And I asked them I gave them names of a series of countries, and I asked them to tell me just instant reactions what they thought the percentage of Muslims was. One of them was Australia. My students think there's over 20%. Over 20% of people in Australia are Muslims.
2.5%.
Right? These are politics students. So God knows what the average Australian thinks. We do know from surveys that half of Australians think that Muslim immigration should be stopped. It's pretty high. We also know that, you're right, Australia is quite accommodating towards immigration, but we also know what Australia does to people who come by boat and how that's accepted in this country. So I think there is a market there, for anti-Islam and also anti-refugees. Sorry, Frank.
Probably just say on that as well that Hanson, I think, moved from the Aboriginal community to Asian to Islam.
Yes.
So it's sort of, it's covering all bases. Yeah,
Exactly.
Frank.
Which is a nice bridge to Shah's question on
Yeah.
inequality. So I think the bridge that I'd like to introduce here is, and this is something we've talked about a lot in our work, where we analyse speeches, how politicians frame the world for us, how we frame particular communities, and so forth. So I spent hours and hours analysing Marine Le Pen's speeches and Jörg Haider's speeches and so forth. One of the simple things that comes out is that, the economy is not necessarily a simple predictor of what's going to happen. What you have is supply and demand factors, as we call them. The supply or the demand factors are what I call, explaining to my students, this is the spontaneous anxieties, the spontaneous fears, and that might bubble up in a reaction to, say, events. But of course you have the supply side as well, which is populist leaders telling us what the danger is and where it comes from, which group is to be blamed. So that's a bit of a bridge to then your question about inequality. This is indeed what we're now looking at, inequality. Sense of entitlement, bubble economies, fear, I'm okay to do, but there's rumours that this is a bubble economy, maybe I can't pay up my mortgage or whatever it may be. If you look at inequality and the Gini coefficient that you refer to, we've collected now data from multiple countries, I think it's 27 countries, the Gini coefficient and perceptions of inequality. And you see that there's hardly any relationship. I think the data that we have is already publishable in and of itself, because what we can show quite easily is that the objective Gini coefficient tells you very little or nothing about perceived fairness and perceived inequality. So the two completely go against each other. And I think that again brings me back to the supply and demand. It's not just inequality in and of itself. We find countries where the Gini coefficient is through the roof, as it were, where inequality isn't perceived as a problem, and others where it is. And then you talk about leadership influence again, right? So it's work in progress, but we're certainly taking inequality very seriously, but we do it in a way that we've also looked at the economy and its relationship with populist appeal.
Well, just 2 points. I would agree with you on that, Frank, and I don't think just a pure inequality measure, as I adverted to earlier, is the right way to go about it, simply because I think people, when they say, well, this is our lot, and there's someone over there who's incredibly wealthy, well, we all grumble a little bit, and that's how they are. The traditional society that existed for all of creation prior to the egalitarianism to a far greater extent of the 20th century. And as I said earlier, I think what annoys people now is when they see academics, and I don't mean academics in the correct sense of the word as exists out here, I mean academics that someone who's gone to university, that's what they would view as an academic, when they go to a football match and they see how come, I'm a plasterer and I'm earning this, whereas I see that doctor and lawyer and academic and solicitors and how come they're all on that, they've got all those sorts of cars and that sort of flash house. It's a far more real comparison to me in terms of how they react, and so I would be interested to see if you could actually look at in those terms. The other really interesting thing is that one of the things that research shows up in these groups is that they are quite opposed to welfare, except when it relates to them. So welfare that is given to others is seen as unfair and they're not entitled to, but the welfare that they get, then in fact they are entitled to, and it's quite reasonable, and indeed is, if anything, should be increased. Interestingly, in the United States, a lot of the research showed that people were happy to vote against Obamacare even when it was against their interests, because they sort of thought that, well, look, Trump promises me a job, and if I get a job, then with a job becomes health benefits, and therefore I don't care about Obamacare because it won't apply to me anymore. Now, of course, that's a flawed logic, but that's what they do.
Mind you, I'm not sure most plasterers are necessarily.
No, I was going to say that. They CFMEU have probably done a very good deal for them, so probably bad choice. Shop assistants.
Got one question from Roger, but if anybody else has got a question, I'll take two together. Any other? Let's go from Roger. Yeah.
Three quick ones. One for each.
Very quick.
Right.
Yeah.
First of all, in terms of Duncan's reference back to the Western Australian results, I think it's important to see the way that's been recalculated. That Dorling at the Australia Institute has suggested that she did very well. She just had very high expectations. She was selling to her followers without any real basis for winning lower house seats. So she's won 2 seats in the upper house. She said she'd win 3 and she won 2. That's just on Frank's thing, I was really interested in the problem of how you define right wing. Because Lionel, who's a member of the Senate, asked the question rhetorically, is Hanson a communist? And he is arguing about some of the issues that Paul has alluded to, that they are in fact protectionist.
Yep.
And they're also claim to have a right-wing Labor, which is in a sense not right-wing, Labor origins, so that the members of her party in Parliament claim to be legitimate inheritance of a Labor tradition, the Labor tradition of Arthur Corbell and the racism that went with that. So right wing doesn't quite work for if you have Liberal as one of those extremes. And the third thing with Paul is the question about religion and whether religion is relevant in the Hanson case, even though she's anti-Muslim. I think she defines her vision of religion as secular. And you go onto the website and she's not full of wowsers, she's not full of people who are trying to manage Christian values. Their values are much more liberal, small L liberal, and so that seems to me to be an important thing. And the final point is when you're defining populism, how much does conspiracy theory come into it? How much do you have to have a conspiracy theory in order to explain why things are so bad? Or whether that's a characteristic of populism, but particularly in terms of climate change, where climate change is attributed to all sorts of conspiracy theories, just as anti-vaccination, just as concern over a whole range of other issues, which are seen to be somehow related to them conspiring against us.
Interesting points about this idea that populism does not necessarily locate itself easily on a spectrum of left and right, and that's the full circle. And we shouldn't forget the Hitler's Party was, of course, the National Socialist Party. Yeah. So, comments, responses. Do you want to start with Duncan?
Just on the point of Western Australia, absolutely. I remember the Western Australia election, the Dutch elections were more or less the same period, and as I said, I think in the presentation, we saw the exact same phenomenon. I'm not sure how much it was just the likes of Hanson and Builders building up their own things, but I think there has been a huge media narrative in the last. The media have discovered populism in the last year, and they're convinced that it was invented in Britain, the United States. Yeah. Unfortunately, Western Europe, we've been doing that stuff very well for a very long time. Obviously it suited their narrative. They all rushed from Amsterdam to Paris, then hoping Marine Le Pen would do well. If you look back, as I say, 2 years ago, and you were to be told Hanson's going to win seats in the Western Australia legislature, you would have said, wow, really? That's amazing. So I think we've got to look at this a little bit like, it's like climate change or stocks. You might get a bad year, but the trend overall is pretty clear on where populist parties are going, be that in Australia or in Western Europe. Your point about conspiracy theories, I think, that fits into the idea that populism proposed an idea that there's a series of bad elites in cahoots plotting against the people, usurping their sovereignty, undermining their rights, their prosperity, their traditional values, etc., etc. And that actually, so that produces conspiracy theories. It also leads into, there was your point as well about religion being used to, Hanson's use of religion. I'd agree. I mean, I think it's hard given her own personal history for Hanson to claim she's a committed Christian, but certainly she does use religion to define us and them, and in particular them, which is what Wilders does as well in the Netherlands.
Thanks, Duncan.
Right, on the question about left or right, and I think there's a lot written about this as well. There's been, of course, authors who've tried to pigeonhole them and say, well, is this a free market agenda? Jörg Haider, is he really a free market answer for? Increasingly, I think populist parties can be seen as jumble sales people, right? They have a jumble sales of ideas, and some of it is neo-Marxist, and other is it's nativist, right-wing, nationalistic, usual themes. So especially if you do speech analysis, that becomes very clear. You sit there looking carefully at every sentence, and you think, like, how on earth can somebody stand in front of a group of people in some kind of building and utter these words in one speech, and not a single person says, well, are you a neo-Marxist, or are you a right-wing traditionalist? Anyway, but of course you then see also that how that's played out. Pauline Hanson, for example, speeches in Newcastle will be very different than if she goes to somewhere in the vicinity of Brisbane, right? So in Newcastle she'll talk about the working class steel worker, and how this is a steel town, and I understand you because I'm a battler Australia. Her narrative, of course, changes slightly, and also with it, the left-right spectrum changes moderately. Which brings me also to the conspiracy theory. I think there's also an interesting nexus between perceived inequality and conspiracy theorizing, the popularity of them. Of course, they are, whether you talk in a left-wing manner about conspiracy theories being tax havens and how money is flooding in all sorts of directions offshore, that would be featuring quite large in some speeches. At the same time, you hear conspiracies about multinationals being used to bring in workers from overseas. So I think protectionism is indeed this thing that sits awkwardly in the middle, where yes, in fact, there is a certain appeal amongst the left, of course, for populism as well, a certain aspiration. Who was it a couple of weeks ago? They said, well, actually, Trump, he is a Keynesian, right? What he does is would be exactly what Keynes would tell us to do. Don't be afraid of debt, build big infrastructure project, be protectionist, and Bob's your own, right? So there is a weird kind of mixture of left-wing right ideas, and I'll leave it at that.
I really like Frank's thing about the jumble sale, and actually when you have a look at in there, it's changed a little bit now, but their original manifestation, One Nation, 2/3 ex-LNP voters, 1/3 ex-Labor voters. And so that appeal to all, something in there for someone, it was very much part of their get-go, but also, of course, therefore translating to seats won in outer urban ring and rural hinterland. Outer urban ring, traditionally Labor sort of areas, rural hinterland, from Conservatives. I would say this though, if you had a look at someone like Liz Cunningham, who certainly isn't in their category, what she used to do in Gladstone in a working class seat is on every non-union industrial issue, she would vote in a Labor sort of way. Everything else she would vote for the Tories, because she was fundamentally a Tory. Hanson isn't like that. If you actually have a look at Hanson's Senate voting record, she's a small business person, right-wing worker exploiter. And, it will be interesting to see whether she actually has the brains from the point of view of her own survival to go into left field sometimes, so she can actually sort of say to a group of people who would have otherwise been working class people who that, listen, I voted this way in your political interests. We'll see whether she is actually, whether she does that. One final short point, you always have to be careful though when you interpret political results in Australia, because with upper houses, not all upper houses are elected the same way. Ours, we don't have one. Western Australia is elected in provinces, as is Victoria. New South Wales, Tasmania individual electorates. New South Wales and South Australia are elected at large. So far easier for her people to get, a significant vote in places like New South Wales and South Australia, because it's a far smaller quota.
I'm going to sneak one quick question in from Connie, who works in this area as well.
Very, only recently, but I really enjoyed your presentations, and I just have a question for the panel as to, given the issue about conspiracy theories and media and all this kind of stuff, whether you are seeing a correlation between Twitter or social media and the rise of these parties, just in light of recent research that is showing like groups such as UKIP and Donald Trump doing very well as kind of alt perspectives on that medium that's part of their outreach. I'm just wondering whether you've noticed that in your research at all.
Can I say something very briefly? I'm actually meeting tomorrow, or no, the day after tomorrow, with 3 RAs who are going to do work on this for us, because we have a grant looking at inequality, and I'm particularly interested in how perceived meritocracy, inequality, the nexus between that and conspiracy theorizing. So it's work in progress once again. But it's been a long-standing interest that I have as well in the fake news. Look at, for example, Trump, and without making the mistake that Trump is now suddenly populism and whatever, when before it wasn't. But look at InfoWars and Alex Jones and the likes, where there's a direct connection between Donald Trump being in Alex Jones's ear and vice versa. And Alex Jones even commenting at some point, oh, isn't it funny how Donald Trump says on national media what I've been talking to him 4 or 5 days ago. So Donald Trump has been really effectively at using the latent New World Order conspiracy theories, which are very much, again, the jumble sale of left-wing conspiracies and right-wing conspiracies all together, and a bit of protectionism as the cherry on the cake. So it is a fascinating domain, and I think there must be something about perceived inequality as well, the link between it, and I'm going to, with my team, hopefully look at that more carefully. But not in the sense of the Gini coefficient, inequality in an objective manner can be predicting how much people. It's all about how people frame the fairness of society. Right? That's very such thoughts rather than an answer.
Look, I'm not an expert on social media. I'll simply say this, that what really worries me with the destruction of the traditional media is that, and universal access to the internet, which is itself a good thing, the latter not the former, is that people will obviously now seek media that they are interested in and that satisfies and reinforces their prejudices. So if I'm pro-vaccination, as I am, I'm not going to subscribe to websites that are anti-vaccination nutters, but that by extension people will actually then similarly with their political views, and they will just get more and more and more and more reinforced, and that's what worries me, that we'll have people within their own little silos of existence that will form their political views, and they'll get cultured and get more and more and more and more without any opportunity to have them questioning those sort of things, and that's a very serious problem.
Duncan.
I just second Paul's point there about the extent to which we live in increasingly in echo chambers in which we just hear opinions that we like and so on. If you looked at my Twitter feed, you'd think that we were all lovely Guardian reading liberals who were against Brexit and Trump. The other thing I would just say, I'm doing another project at the moment on youth wings in Australia and Germany, and I notice a stark contrast between how well some of these right-wing populist parties use either Twitter or Facebook and how poorly mainstream parties use them. I can't even find a contact for somebody in West Australian Young Labour because their Facebook page hasn't been updated for I don't know how long. Their Twitter hasn't been updated in 2 years. And this is something I'm finding, particularly amongst the Labour Party and to some extent amongst the Liberals across Australia. They have no idea how to use these things. And this is supposed to be for young people.
Wow.
They're way behind the game compared to the populists in this.
Well, Mike Kaiser, known to many here, his son is president of Queensland Young Labour this year, so hopefully we can get him in contact with you, and also a Griffith student, I might add.
I'm afraid we're going to have to wind up at this point. We've hit the hour mark. It's been a fabulous conversation. Thank you, Duncan, Frank, and Paul, and thank you for coming and spending your lunchtime with us. So, thank you.